Hello, everyone, and welcome to Functional Fertility, the podcast designed to demystify your hormones, up-level your lifestyle, and supercharge your fertility potential. I'm your host, Dr. Kalea Wattles, and today's episode is all about mindset. As we prepare to conceive, as we enter into the transformational journey that is pregnancy, and as we prepare to find our new and different identity in the postpartum world. Joining me today is my friend, Dr. Kirstin Lauritzen, a mindset coach for women and moms. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. K. She earned her doctorate in chiropractic and moved on to further training, getting her master's in human nutrition and functional medicine. And then she up-leveled even further with a certification in neuro-linguistic programming. She believes a truly holistic approach to the body is vital for creating optimal health, and that we have the power to create anything we want in our life. Dr. K is the founder and owner of Northwest Functional Medicine and drkirstin.com. I've been so looking forward to this. Welcome to the show, Dr. K.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm like trying to control my excitement.
The excitement is palpable, and I recently recorded an episode on your podcast. So this is a podcast. We're on a podcast partnership right now.
We are. And if for those that are listening, the podcast that we did together was really, really good too. So I'm super excited to kind of take the second step.
Yeah. And I feel so lucky as a podcast host. I'm sure you feel the same, that I have this network of people who I get to learn from all the time. Mm-hmm. And I was really looking forward to this conversation that's about mindset, because obviously in my fertility practice, there's a potential for emotions to really get stirred up. And we're going to talk about how we work through some of those and how we create space and honor some of those today. So I think this is going to be really valuable for anyone, no matter where you are in your fertility journey. If you're just, decided right now that you want to get pregnant for the very first time and you're thinking about it, or you're doing IUI, you're doing IVF, wherever you are, mindset is going to be beneficial for you. So to set the scene for today's conversation, will you just start to talk us through the difference between our conscious mind and our subconscious mind? Because there's a lot going on there, and I want to give us a little primer.
Yeah, totally. And I think in this, we'll kind of dissolve some of the misconceptions around what mindset is, because I think a lot of people have this like, oh, I need to have a more positive mindset. And that's what mindset kind of is sort of driven as. But that's not what we're talking about here necessarily. So your conscious mind and your subconscious mind, when we're looking at how much of our lives are controlled, or like how much we experience our lives in our conscious mind, that's like 5% of what we experience. They say it's like 95 to 97% of like what we experience in our lives is actually our subconscious mind, which is wild when you think about it, because the subconscious is considered subconscious because it's unaware. It's like operating in the background. You think about like the subconscious mind controls your heart beating and you taking breaths and you like literally existing, the things that you don't need to think about all the time to make it happen. So similarly, within our mindset, the subconscious mind is all of our patterns, all of our beliefs, all of our systems and things that we have basically grown up with and developed this mindset. And then all of those patterns are things that are played out in our life. So we could have beliefs that are working for us, and we could have beliefs that are considered like limiting beliefs that maybe aren't working for us. But whether the key is kind of being aware of what we're doing and bringing awareness to those patterns, because really what we can do is we can change them. And that's how we can take that power back from the thing that is happening that we don't want and be able to create something that we do want. Can I keep going just a little bit on this?
Yeah, please do. And just as you're talking, I'm identifying all these times in my life when I've had something happen. And then there's the story I've told myself about what was happening. So yes, please continue.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So a couple other things that we want to keep in mind here with the subconscious and conscious mind is that first off, we can also bring those subconscious things to the conscious mind. This is how we gain awareness, but then we also take it from being something that's like unaware and happening to being able to change it. Now, where a lot of these things are created is between like 0 and 8 years old. And of course, there's more that happen along the way, but typically our subconscious mind is generated and created around that time. So it's influenced by
Hmm.
ourselves, by our parents, by people in our life, aunts, uncles, grandparents, teachers, friends, parents, friends, like kids our age, right? So we're just soaking up this entire world between like 0 to 8. And this is what's wild is that those are literally what, as adults, so many of our beliefs and patterns are coming from that time, which is crazy when you think about it. Um, so then the next thing that we want to think about here too is that we all have filters. So while we're creating all of these beliefs and all of these things, what they're doing is it's creating a filter of how we're going to see the world, which we can change the filters. Think about it this way, like if you've ever wanted to buy a car or a pair of shoes that you've been like eyeing and you decide, okay, I want that specific thing, then you start seeing it everywhere. Like, like I wanted a Toyota 4Runner. It was like something that was like a big dream of mine. And when I finally made that decision, I saw them everywhere. Like, everywhere. And
You
I
had the
still do.
Forerunner filter that was really active.
Well, it was also very active, yes. It was a very popular thing at the time. But you know what I mean, right? Like you start to see them everywhere. And what you've essentially told your brain is like, I want you to focus on finding more of this thing.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
what happens is when we have a filter, let's say a belief of, um, I'm trying to think of one in particular with like fertility, for example, but I can kind of give you like some examples of how these typically play out of like, um, especially in like a term of a limiting belief, the brain will start collecting evidence of like, oh, I don't deserve to have what I want. Okay, so we believe somewhere along the lines that that we're not worthy of receiving this thing. So then the brain will collect evidence of more of that, reinforcing that belief. And then that is literally what gets created in our life. So when we change that filter to say, oh, like, okay, let's try this, like, I am worthy and I'm enough, which we can actually like rewire the brain. And we can do that in, do lots of different ways of doing that, but so a lot of people will do this on their own without coaches, as far as with like meditations or affirmations. We don't even have to believe it. All we really have to, it takes a lot longer, I will say that, but you don't even have to believe it. You can literally repeat an affirmation and be like, I'm worthy, I'm enough. But when we change that filter, now we're telling the brain, hey, I want you to focus on collecting more evidence of this. And then when that filter changes, just like it does with the car, now we're going to start collecting evidence for the new belief. And that's how we can start to use the power of our subconscious mind to create what we want.
That is so cool to think about. And also, my kids are 6 and 9. So I'm in that zone
Mhm.
of where their subconscious mind is developing. And it makes me just really want to go and hype them up so that they have
Heck yeah.
these filters that are collecting evidence that they will do greatness in the world. So thank you for that reminder.
Yeah.
This is kind of a strange question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I am a manifester. Like that terminology works for me. I think it's fun. I know it doesn't work for everybody and that it can
Totally.
feel silly, but I love to to talk about manifesting things. Is
Mhm.
that really what we're doing when I say like I'm going to manifest this? I'm really changing my filter so that I'm collecting evidence that I can do or have or feel that thing.
Yeah, yep. We could call it the term of manifesting. We could call it, I mean, for many different people in any way that you want to look at it, anytime you say like, I want something specifically, like
Mhm.
you're essentially saying out loud, you're sort of declaring that like, this is something that I want.
Yeah.
And then when you do that, you're now giving yourself the opportunity, and life will do this. This is the weirdest thing, but like when you declare it, life will literally give you opportunities then to say, okay, here's all of the things that we believe that are contrary to that thing. So we need to work through all of this so we can actually hold and get what we want. So, yes, this is manifesting, this is prayer, this is any of the ways that we like talking to our friends or parents or whoever, no matter what way you want to call it, it is just saying like, this is something I want to create and I'm going to do it.
Love. I have this little room in the top of my house. It, I think, was used as a linen closet before, but it's big enough that I created it into what I call the Zen Den.
Oh, I love that.
It's amazing. I painted it totally dark colors and I hung a little cloud light. And the wall that I look at when I'm on my meditation mat, I like cut out pictures and it is a vision board. I mean, the wall
Love it.
is a vision board now, and I
Yep.
just keep adding to it. And it's so helpful because it helps me to feel the feeling of the things that I want.
Yep.
And it's amazing.
Yep. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about here today, too, because especially when we talk about fertility and infertility, like all of that, yes,
Mhm.
like we are of the same.
Yeah.
I'm here with you for all the vision things. Um, and I love that. And I want one of those rooms.
Yes.
But also, yes, so like those emotions and those feelings, like I think very similarly to, we could actually maybe talk about this in the terms of like money, for example. Like a lot of people have a lot of like limiting beliefs around money.
Yes.
And so, like, one of our things as far as that goes is we want to shift our feelings and our emotions around how we experience money. The same thing goes for fertility and for getting pregnant. If we are kind of getting stuck in that root of like not feeling very good about it over and over and over again, I mean, there's a relationship there that we
Yeah.
definitely want to work on and we want to work out because yeah, when you have that fear, when you have those things of like, oh gosh, what if we don't get it yet again this month? Or like kind of in similar ways of looking at money, like, oh gosh, what if I don't have enough to pay the bills again every single month? The relationship, that fear that happens there is really hard. And that can influence what we're calling in and what we're creating. So, yes, the emotions and feeling it when you say you're looking at that vision board and really feeling that in your body, the good feelings that those create, it's exactly what we're looking at.
It's interesting hearing you talk about the money piece because this comes up in my fertility practice so much about if I made more money, if I had a bigger house, if I had a car with another row, I think I would get pregnant. There's a lot of stories that we create about our ability to parent well because of,
Yep.
financial things, which I totally understand. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. But I
I
think
know.
yeah, it's all kinds of loaded all around on every plane of existence. One theme that comes up that I think is related to mindset that I would love to hear you talk about is control.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes I find when we're trying to get pregnant, there's there's like we're controlling for all the variables, but we just can't control for everything in these scenarios. There's too much that is out of our control. Will you talk to us a little bit about how you help your clients identify when this need for control might actually be a limiting factor and might actually be an obstacle for them achieving those goals? Because I imagine that's a really tough conversation to have.
Yeah, it is. So there's and this is kind of hard to do and so I do recognize that like this is not always easy.
Mhm.
It is quite simple though, but it's not easy. If it
Oh,
was easy, everyone would be doing it, right?
right.
Like that's kind of how I like to do this, say this. But when we think about control, one thing I actually learned through my own journey of getting pregnant and then also my labor experience, which I won't go into, but I did end up having a C-section. I tried to control every single thing that I could along that journey, and that's now why I can teach this today. It's because I've literally learned, like, the ins and out of that, but I realized that in my story, controlling that narrative was me like, I was just planning everything. I was like, "Okay, if this happens, then this, and then if this happens, then this, and then if this happens, then this," and, like, all of this stuff. And I still ended up with the outcome that I ended up with. So, what does that mean? Well, if I'm trying to control all the things, like, does that mean that I'm not gonna get pregnant? Does that mean that like I should just stop planning all the things? That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying though is that when we have all of these things that are tied, like these beliefs, these emotions, these mental spirals, these thoughts, all of these ways of acting and being that are trying to control the outcome and the narrative that we want, we end up getting further and further and further away from what we actually want, which is, I know, sometimes hard to understand and also hard to grasp in the sense of like, that's not what I want. We kind of talk about this a bit as like motivators. So are we motivated towards the thing that we want, or are we actually being motivated by trying to move away from the fear that we have
Mm.
of like not getting pregnant, for example? But this happens in all areas of life. I'm just trying to be specific to fertility.
Mm.
But when we try to then control for all the reasons why we're afraid that like this won't happen for us, or any sort of like, I don't want to have a C-section, for example, um, the it starts to get a little bit messy when we don't actually address like, okay, why is it that I don't want this? What is the story that I'm telling myself that this means? Like, oh, then it means I'm not going to become a mom. Oh, it means that then I'm going to have a C-section. And then as someone who's a natural practitioner, like, and I had all these stories too, because I know as a functional medicine practitioner that C-sections set my kiddo up for some different experiences as far as her gut and all of that stuff goes. Things that you want to try and control for that sometimes you can't. And that's a really great lesson to learn. But my point in all of this is that when we get to the root beliefs of what we're operating off of, we can let go a little bit of the control and allow for life to kind of bring different ways and opportunities for us to still get what we want. And if it doesn't happen necessarily too, because I know for some people, they don't end up getting pregnant. It allows us for the healing journey to also accept what the outcome is for us and not have that necessarily turn into something that we're really resentful of, or we end up carrying with us, for the rest of our life. And then that kind of ends up dictating how we move forward from that.
Mm-hmm. Whew, okay, I have a couple
Yeah.
things that I'm going to try not to forget because I have that. There's just so much juicy info here. So number one, you just reminded me that uh, in times of my life when I also have been very control centric,
Yeah.
I have learned. A mentor told me, and this is probably like common, and just I was resistant to it for whatever reason. But she said surrender, which I think sometimes
Yep.
the opposite of control is surrender. For
Yep.
me, anyway, she said surrender is not giving up, it's
Yep.
giving over,
Yep.
right? Like giving this over to whatever, universe or God or whatever your belief system is, but trusting that it's gonna work out and you do what you can. And wow, I know that seems so simple, but it took such a weight off my shoulder to think about it like that.
Mhm.
Oof.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally what I'm talking about here. And in that surrender too, what we get is, oh, here's an example. And I think that we actually even talked about this. You talked about this on one of your stories, and that's when I first mentioned this too, is like, and I have a friend that experienced this as well, but when someone finally makes the appointment with you to
Yes.
actually see a fertility doctor, and then they all of a sudden, like a few weeks later, are like, oh my gosh, I got pregnant.
And I'm like, I didn't even do
It's
anything yet. Wait, I didn't even do anything.
Yep. I had a friend of mine who's same thing. Like she was really, really struggling. It'd been over a year of trying to get pregnant and she wasn't getting pregnant. And finally somebody was like, hey, just make the appointment. Just make the appointment. Just see what's possible. And as soon as she made the appointment, she got pregnant. That's what we're talking about here is like paying attention to that resistance, right? That resistance that's like, oh, if I make that appointment, then that means that I'm accepting that this is a problem.
Yes.
And then once you actually make the appointment, it gets all of those fears and those things and those like, I'm like literally, for those of you that are listening on the podcast, I'm like, like going like this with my hands because I'm just, you get into the spiral of like what it's going to mean and what it means about you. And then all of these other stories that we're telling ourselves. And then, it just creates a lot more stress for our system, which is actually probably what we're going to talk about next. But when we have that stress in our system, we're not surrendering. We're trying to control. We're trying to kind of like rigidly control all of the and hold on to and grip so tightly to the things that when we do let go and finally say, hey, what if I did try something different? What if I did offer or ask for some support and receive support? What if I did allow for something very different from what I think this could look like to happen? What would that look like? And then magical things oftentimes happen.
What if? I
What
love
if?
that question. I mean, that can really, what if it turned out even better than I can imagine? I love to think about this. So, the other piece that I wanted to just touch on before we moved on is you talked about when you're kind of in a controlling state of your life, you have to look at the driver of that. Like, where is that coming from? What is the root of that control? And for me, I found that I was like masking it under preparedness. You said I wanted to, plan for every outcome. If this happens, then this. If this happens, then this. And it was very easy for me to be like, I'm just prepared. But really, I was catastrophizing,
Mhm.
and it was like putting a down payment on this outcome that I didn't want, but wanted to be prepared for. But you know what I'm saying? Like
Oh,
my
yeah.
motivation was catastrophizing, which was so not healthy for my nervous system.
Mhm.
I think that was very well placed advice to invite us to look at those drivers.
Yeah, and I think I'm so grateful that I did do all that planning because what ended up happening, my specific journey was it was special in what it was. And had I not done a lot of that preparing, I don't know what the outcome would have been. And I'm not sure that I would have been as aware of all of the things that were happening in the story that was playing out. And I do think that because I was more prepared, I actually did make better decisions along the way. So I
Mhm.
don't mean to say that we should, it works for, I have
Yeah.
some people who are completely unprepared for all the things and they're just totally fine with it and they do really well. And that's just their way. That's kind of my point here is that like there are oftentimes people when we know ourselves really well, then we can sort of trust what feels good for us. But even myself, in this whole process of I know all these things, and it still was like this was sort of a pattern that played out for me. I am a student constantly, and I'm constantly learning from myself and from my life and the opportunities that come up for me. And that's where I learn these things so I can teach them.
Yeah. As healthcare providers, we're students for life, which is good because I love being a student. So that's positive. Will you tell us a little bit? And maybe you already shared some of these, but I'm curious, and I think all of our listeners will want to know, okay, well, what are your favorite go-to tips, pro tips to help us to shift that mindset away from the control aspect and more towards freedom and like definitely making informed choices, but having some freedom around that? Will you maybe
Yeah.
give us some of your go-tos?
Yes. And one of the things we're also going to talk about here in the next part of this is more of these tools and these perspective shifts that we like
Mhm.
that are just so important inside of fertility and pregnancy and motherhood. But also, yeah, so couple of things. One thing is to be very aware of what the emotion is that's coming up. So if it's fear or maybe it's guilt or maybe it's shame, like, I know for a little bit after my C-section, well, not for a little bit, I had to work through this, but I felt like my body betrayed me.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Mm.
I felt like, it didn't do what it was supposed to do. I had, like, a whole lot of things, and guilt, fear, they're all emotions that can come up, anger that it didn't happen the way that I wanted it to, all very relatable things, I think. But you getting to what the emotion is and then taking it a step further and asking, "What's my deeper intention here?" Like, why is this here? Because think about it this way, like, you're experiencing something, but we could put somebody else right next to you that's not experiencing that same in the same situation, they are having an entirely different experience. So, what does that lead us to, like, think about that, right? Like, it's obviously something very specific for you, and there's a lesson here to learn. So when we say like, "Okay, What's the story I'm telling myself? What's here for me to learn? Why is this specific thing happening? Then we can get that deeper intention of what it's there to teach us. And then the next step is to feel that emotion and let it go. I know that it can be very painful. I
Mm.
know. I know. And that's oftentimes where that catharsis of like crying, of yelling, and my favorite is in the car because I don't feel judged because I don't think people can hear me. So I will just like yell it out in the car. Um, or movement of some type, whether that's like shaking to get that like anxious feeling out, and just like really moving those emotions through our bodies. It can really get it out of the body so it doesn't stay there. And then this is the most critical step, is to say, okay, well, what do I want? So yes, we've had all this. Now what do I want? And creating an affirmation or something that is like a visual of what we do want. And then you want to post it everywhere in your house, like on your bedside table, on your mirror, on your computer, on your desk, everywhere, and say it to yourself every day. Because you want to be reminding yourself of the thing you do want, not necessarily anytime you get looped back kind of into the old thing. It's like, okay, hey, that's that old thing. We want this new thing. We're focusing on this new thing over here. We're creating that filter of this thing that we do want. And this is the key tier 2, you don't even fully have to believe that it's true. That's the best part about this. It's like you can say it over and over and over again, and eventually your brain will be like, oh, I believe it. Because, and here's the thing too, it's so powerful about the subconscious mind, is that it doesn't even really know the difference between what's imaginary and what's real. So if I say, oh, how cool is it that like I have a 1-year-old? My brain, especially if I'm visualizing it and I'm just like in this state of like, I can literally see it, hear it, taste it, feel it, all of the things. My brain doesn't know that I don't have a 1-year-old necessarily. So the subconscious mind will respond to that, and we can be very influential on our subconscious mind when we say like, isn't it so cool that we created this? And then it knows to start filtering and focusing on creating that thing.
I'm glad you reminded us that we sometimes will need to look at those notes to ourselves, those reminders to ourselves with some frequency, because I remember when I was on the verge of a pretty big life change and I had made what I wanted my computer desktop. And it was
Yeah.
amazing how many times I had to look at that throughout the day to remind myself that that's where I was going. Like, it's very easy to return into those same thought patterns, and it really was helpful to have right at my fingertips those little nudges.
Yep. It's great. I love
Mm.
it.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
As we're talking about these emotions that can come up for people, a lot of my patients have read the book The Body Keeps the Score, which
Perfect.
talks about, like how our emotions can manifest in our body. And I saw someone sent me a meme the other day and it said, "Can the body just stop keeping score at this point?" It really cracked me up, and I totally relate to that. But I wanted to get your hot take on this and have you walk us through a little bit about how the body holds on to those negative emotions and how that might manifest in a human body. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So I'm going to bring up let's do this 2 ways. Okay. So first off, to set the stage, your emotions and your neurotransmitters are felt by every single cell in your body. So as soon as you experience an emotion, whether it's happy or like positive or negative in the terms of those, your whole body experiences that feeling. So I want you to, like, for the listeners out there, if you're not driving, but you can probably think about this. If you can remember a time where you felt really anxious, yeah, if you really remember a time where you felt really anxious, you can probably start to feel those feelings. Like sometimes people feel a tightness in their chest, or they start to feel, yep, I get really
Hot
tight in my
cheeks.
throat.
Yeah. Hmm.
But also some people, and um, some people will really relate to this, especially if this is one of their patterns. But if you ever think about like going on stage and like the first thing they think of is like, I've got to go to the bathroom. because their gut is literally responding with those same neurotransmitters, which is a very excitatory state. So the body literally is like, okay, we're going to do this. And that's actually a side note. That's why I use a lot of this work with functional medicine, because your mind and these emotions can dictate what's happening on our with our chronic illness stuff as well, which is really a whole nother thing to talk about. But let's also say to contrast that with something like a time where you were so happy, where you were so happy. Let's leave you with that, not something else. But thinking about a time where you were so happy, your body will literally feel that too, and you can feel it throughout your whole system. So why that's so important as far as negative emotions goes, that is that if we are either trying to ignore our emotions, trying to stuff them down, or we don't have a very good process for them, or somewhere along the way, I know a lot of millennials will kind of get this one of just like, there were a lot of emotions that typically weren't really okay for us to express. So anger being one of them, being sad and expressing that in like public places. There's a lot of things that we were told, like, oh, you can't act or be that way. So when you have that, then we tend to kind of stuff those down and try not to experience them. And when that happens, then they get stored in the body. There's an article that was written by Sally Dickerson et al., and it was published in the Psychosomatic Medicine Journal in 2004. I know we're all about our science. The title was Immunological Effects of Induced Shame and Guilt. And so you could go look it up. It's a great article, a research paper. And one of the things that they found was that when our body experiences some of these negative emotions, cytokines, inflammation rises. So we know that these emotions are actually having a physiological effect on our body. So now, when we're thinking about, okay, if we're in these sort of like, let's say, I know that fertility being one of them can be all encompassing. It's like thought of from when you wake up in the morning to when you go to bed, and then all throughout the night, might even still be like dreaming of it. You might be waking up. It's just is like entirely consuming. If what's happening is those kind of negative spirals and emotions and the stress around it is keeping you in this fight or flight state of that, that's that sympathetic nervous system. For the people who are kind of tracking with that, is like we're in that fight or flight place. All our blood is going to our muscles. It's not going to the places that help us reproduce.
Yeah.
It's not going to our brain. It's not going to our digestive system to help us assimilate those nutrients that we need. So when that happens, like our brain is basically saying like, hey, it's not safe to reproduce right now. So we're not going to do it. And so you can see how not only are we perpetuating the negative emotions and the fears that are driving our mindset and keeping us in this like cage of like, is this going to happen? Is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? Is it going to happen? And then it can also actually be influencing the physical body and what's happening and what the brain is telling the body to do. So it's not just about bottom up medicine, like looking at the physical body, but it's also about top down. What is the brain telling the body to do? It's a whole different perspective and way to look at why humans experience the things that they do with their health.
And hearing you read the title of that paper, it made me think, oh, maybe this is an avenue worth exploring for all my patients that have autoimmune disease. With the shame and the guilt, and that seems like a really relevant connecting point.
Yes, the autoimmune one is really interesting too, because quick side note, because this is a whole other podcast, but looking at the patterns that are often associated with autoimmune disease, perfectionism, people pleasing. I saw a post, it was probably by the holistic psychologist, most likely. But one of the things she was saying was, and this is absolutely true, which is that if we were raised in a way that like we were trying to suppress our own feelings and like be the good girl, be the one who was always doing the right thing, these patterns all show up in very common ways. And one of those can definitely be autoimmune.
We might need a whole follow-up episode on that concept specifically because
Yep.
I have a lot of that in my practice. So stay tuned, y'all. We might have to dig in there. But I'll promise I'll keep us on track.
Mhm.
When we're looking at negative emotions, or even I might even extend this to say trauma, like
Yep.
in all forms, big T trauma, as I say, or little T trauma. Sometimes I'll talk to patients and we're diving into their mental, emotional, spiritual health, and they'll be like, I don't know. I don't have any trauma. Like nothing's happened to me. I've been all good for always. But then in functional medicine, we use this tool called the timeline. And I'm like, okay, building this timeline. And then it comes out like, maybe it's even, this is an example from a real patient I had. She fell off a horse when
Mhm.
she was like 10 and then was terrified of horses after that. And like the whole experience was really traumatic. But if you would have just asked her, she would have been like, no, I don't have anything. I'm all good. How do you help your clients to find those things in their story that maybe they're holding on to in their body? I mean, is it just a history collection? What tools do you have? Because I get stuck here.
Yeah, totally. So the timeline is a really, really good one. This also can be challenging though too, right? Because part of it is data mining, so asking questions about just your life,
Yeah.
like, hey, what, or, and also if we were to speak about, let's say, fertility, for example, and say, like, okay, well, let's say that it has been a struggle. Let's just use that as our baseline. It's just starting to ask questions like, okay, well, what specifically feels like it's a struggle? Like, why is that specifically the story that's being told here? What does it mean about you?
Mm-hmm.
What are you making this story mean to you? How do you feel about this specific thing? It's a way to start, right? And then as we kind of we build the story a little bit more, then those other things can start to come in. But it's also too, I would say, a journey. And I think wherever you start, like, I will tell you this, I was someone that I knew I experienced some pretty big stuff, but I also was like, I don't do emotions because they're too painful. And I left all of that in the past. And so I'm not
Yep.
there for that anymore. And there's two phases of that. So there's like the repression side that I was just talking about. There's also like the deeper repression side of like, we don't even remember the things
Mm-hmm.
that happened back then because they were so traumatic. The brain's like, oh, we're not gonna even see it that way. We're not gonna remember it. We're just gonna leave it. And this is also too where I tend to partner up with therapists and people who are certified and really experienced with trauma, because I do help on some sides with trauma, but also I think it's really important to bring in people who are, also certified to work with trauma as well. But it does come up often when we start bringing awareness to some of the things. But it too, I think the other, sorry, one more thing.
Yeah.
The other piece is that we sometimes can tend to look at those things as like, oh, well, that wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't the big stuff that you hear about as far as what we say is trauma. But the thing is like whatever dysregulated the nervous system, whatever created a lot of fear, or whatever the body remembers as something that was unsafe can be described as trauma. It can be defined as that. So it's, um, sometimes a way of us just sort of like gaslighting ourselves was like, oh, well, that really wasn't that big of a thing. Or it has nothing to do with what's happening right now. But the thing is that the brain doesn't know that. The brain knows the patterns and the beliefs and the things that it believes. So it doesn't always make conscious logical sense. It's just what the brain is tied all the things to. The other thing too is we map our beliefs with emotions. So you might have experienced this client may have experienced fear with this accident on the horse. Now we're experiencing fear in the fertility side. It doesn't really know the difference between the two. It just knows that, like, oh, fear links to this belief, and now we are experiencing fear here. So now this is the same thing that we're going to experience here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Data
Makes
mining.
sense. So, okay, we figure out we have some negative emotions. We got to work through them. I'm sure this is a complicated treatment, but how do you start to process these?
Yeah. The original pattern that I talked about is one that is so from a do-it-yourself perspective, this
Mhm.
is like the one to do. It's one that I teach inside of my course. And then there's more that we can do from like the one-on-one perspective. And I do this in the like group leading through of that course. But the DIY one is really just like identify the emotion, figure out what that deeper intention is. And again, journaling, great resource, or talking it out with someone who can just sit and hold space and listen and not like interject, or sitting and just kind of thinking it out in your head. Deeper intention. Why is this here? What do I need to learn? What's it trying to tell me? Get the emotion out of the body, feel it, let it pass through, and then create that. What do I actually want? What do I want instead? Let's create that reframe. And then from there, it's just continuing to use that over and over and over and over again. And like now in my brain, I was just talking with a friend of mine, it's automated. I kind of just automatically do it in my brain when things come up, which is such a cool thing to
Yeah.
realize, like that like I feel an emotion and then my brain just goes through a series and I get what I want out of it. A really, really cool way to use our brain. But the other way that we can do this too is we can go back in time. And this is what I do with my one-on-one clients is we go back to the original event where you first experienced that emotion. And then when we clear that out and learn what we need to learn from the event, you still have you still have the memory, but now we've pulled that thread of where all of the times up until now you've experienced that negative emotion, so that now when you move forward, we can look at those negative emotions as things that are trying to tell us something. They are our guide. So we now can say, well, if I'm angry about something, is someone crossing a boundary? Is this something, am I interacting with something in my environment in the way that like, this is not how I want to view the world? Or this is not in alignment with me in some way? Now you start to get, instead of having all of these emotions come up all at once and kind of getting this like chaos of just like whoa, so much emotion, now we get a different perspective and can interact with our emotions in a much different way. So those are like the two different ways that we can do it. There's many others. There's many other ways of doing it, but these are just the ways that I tend to do this with my clients.
Wow. This is very motivating to work on our own stuff.
Yeah.
A question that came up for me as I was listening to you describe this process. Do you have to be able to label the emotion to process it? Is that a requirement?
Great question. Yes and no. What I say, and I had to do this. Okay, so this is like this was one thing that I had to do, and actually so did my husband. He was given this by his therapist, and funny story, just real funny story.
Yeah.
So he like I met him, and he was like, "Yeah, I had to like a therapist gave me a list of like what are the emotions," and at the time I hadn't done any of this work, and I was like, "Oh,
Okay.
okay." And then the first thing that I was like required to do that was given to me as homework was to print out a thing of emotions.
I'm sure he felt very validated in that moment.
I'm sure he did. Anyway, yes. One of the things that can be very helpful is to just go online and see a list of emotions and go throughout your day and say, like, how am I feeling right now? What's coming up for me? And look on that list of like, oh, I feel that way, and start learning what these feelings are and what the names of them are and start linking them. And then it can get really fun because then people can say like, "Oh, how are you doing?" And we usually have ways we typically respond to that. "Oh, I'm fine. Oh, I'm good. I'm doing great." Whatever. It's really fun when you get to say, it has been a delicious day today.
Ooh, very descriptive.
Right? Like what a different way to like kind of catch us out of our typical patterns and try on something new. And now for both people, that's like, oh, how interesting. And it really can change and shift just how we are going throughout our day. So anyway, fun things like that.
Yeah. Ooh, that's super helpful. Okay, so now that I know I'm not the only one that's like, okay, it's time for me to do some mindset work. Will you tell us where we can find you, a bit about your business, and about mindset for motherhood?
Yes. Okay. So people can find me at drkirstin.com. And I will say we are in a little bit of a transition there. So I work a lot with athletes, but I work with everybody typically. But what we're doing now, Mindset for Motherhood, because this was such a big transformational journey for me and something that I am very passionate about, is that I really wanted to help women create the motherhood that they want, that they desire, because we can lose ourselves in motherhood. I also experienced a lot of like negativity as far as how motherhood was being described. And it was one of the reasons why I put off becoming a mom for so long, because I had sort of been in this loop of like, my life will be over when I become a mom. And I don't know how I can possibly be able to own a business and then do this at the same time.
Yep.
So what it's really about is transforming our relationships with ourselves and with motherhood. It's about stopping those negative mental spirals that we've talked about today. It's about fostering our mental resilience and finding joy and possibility through motherhood. Like, what a great way to, instead of seeing motherhood as this thing that's tanking my mindset and my brain and my mental well-being, and actually being able to thrive with our mental well-being inside of motherhood. Like, I just love it. So the course is accessible at any time in a do-it-yourself fashion. And then if you do join now, then the next group, when we do it live, if that's your jam and you love the accountability and the community and the support of those live containers, you get automatically enrolled into that container. So you get a little bit of like the best of both worlds. So you get to get started now, start making the progress towards what you want. And then too, if you want that extra bonus, you get to join the next round when we do that, which will probably be the time of this recording, May, June-ish timeframe.
That is an incredible benefit, just for the record. That is so amazing. So everybody head on over to the website, check out Mindset for Motherhood. I have learned so much in this episode, and I'm already dreaming and hoping and manifesting some follow-up episodes. So we're going to make that happen because it's already on my vision board. To our listeners, thank you so much for being with us and trusting us as a source of information. To our show's producer, Paola Martini, thank you so much for making my podcast dreams come true. And Kirstin, thank you so much for sharing all these gems and clinical insights. This has been so valuable, and I just can't wait to chat with you again soon.
Yay, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time. Did you love this episode and want to hear more? Head over to drkaleawattles.com/podcast, where you can find more episodes on all things fertility.